The air in the penthouse suite was ablaze. Kwon Jin-woo sat at the head of a monolithic obsidian table, the city of Seoul a-glittering, indifferent tapestry behind him. His stillness was a form of gravity, pulling the tension in the room into a tight, suffocating knot. Across from him, the men from the Busan syndicate shifted in their seats, their bravado leaking away like sand through cupped hands. They had come to negotiate, to posture, to test the borders of his empire. They were learning, with each passing second of his unnerving silence, that his borders were not lines on a map, but the edge of a precipice. His fingers were steepled before him, a perfect, unbreachable cage. He had not spoken in 7 minutes. He was letting the silence do the work, letting it strip them down to their raw, twitching ambition. His right hand, Minjun, stood by the window, a statue in a perfectly tailored suit, his reflection a ghost superimposed over the sprawling metropolis. The only sounds were the faint hum of the climate control and the frantic, shallow breathing of the man directly opposite Jin-woo, a man whose sweat was beginning to stain the collar of his expensive shirt. Jin-woo was about to speak, to deliver the verdict that would either enrich or erase these men, when a sound broke the spell. It was not a gunshot, not a shout, but something far more disruptive. The soft, hesitant click of a door handle. Every head in the room, conditioned by years of paranoia, snapped towards the sound. The heavy oak door swung inward, revealing a woman in a dark blue maid's uniform. She was new. He'd never seen her face before. She clutched a feather duster like a shield, her eyes wide and lost as she took in the scene. The circle of grim-faced men, the palpable hostility, the man at the head of the table who commanded it all. And then her eyes met his. The world, for Kwon Jin-woo, did not just stop. It fractured. The obsidian table, the city lights, the sweating men from Busan, they all dissolved into a meaningless periphery. Because the woman in the cheap, ill-fitting uniform was not a stranger. Her name was Samira. She was his wife. His ex-wife. And she was pregnant, her condition obvious even beneath the shapeless fabric of her uniform. Her breath hitched, a tiny, audible gasp that seemed louder than a thunderclap. The feather duster slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the marble floor with a sound that echoed the shattering of Jin-woo's composure. For a single, frozen heartbeat, the mask he had perfected over a decade of ruthless control disintegrated, and all that was left was the man he had been 5 years ago, the man who had loved her with a desperate, all-consuming fire. The moment stretched, thin and taut, threatening to snap. Jin-woo's expression remained a mask of carved ice, but inside his chest, his heart hammered a violent, chaotic rhythm against his ribs. The men from Busan stared, their initial alarm curdling into confusion and then a dangerous curiosity. A weakness. They were seeing a weakness. He saw the calculation flicker in their eyes. Minjun took a half-step forward, his hand instinctively moving toward the inside of his jacket, but Jin-woo stopped him with a glance so sharp it could have cut glass. He rose from his chair, the movement fluid and deliberate, a predator uncoiling. Every eye followed him. He ignored the Busan contingent, his entire universe narrowed to the woman standing frozen in the doorway. "This meeting," he said, his voice a low, chillingly calm rumble that belied the storm raging within him, "is over." He didn't look at his guests. He didn't need to. They scrambled to their feet, gathering their papers and their shattered confidence, mumbling hasty, respectful farewells that he did not acknowledge. Minjun was already ushering them out a side door, his efficiency a silent promise of control being reasserted. The main door clicked shut, leaving Jin-woo and Samira alone in the cavernous room, the silence now of a different quality, heavy with history, with pain, with the impossible presence of the child she carried. He walked towards her, his polished leather shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the faint tremor in her hands, the exhaustion etched around her beautiful, tired eyes. She looked thinner than he remembered, except for the gentle, undeniable swell of her belly. "Samira," he said, and her name felt foreign on his tongue, a relic from another life. She flinched, her gaze dropping to the floor. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice rough with disuse. I took the wrong turn. The supervisor. I'm new. Her words were a pathetic shield against the magnitude of what was happening. He didn't care about the supervisor or the job. He cared about the 5 years of silence, the disappearance, the life growing inside her. A micro-flashback, sharp and painful, pierced his consciousness. Samira, laughing in their sun-drenched apartment, her head thrown back, a white summer dress swirling around her knees. He'd told her he would burn the world down for her. She had touched his cheek and said, "Don't. Just stay with me." He had failed. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them, before letting it fall back to his side. "Why are you here?" The question was not about the hotel. It was about everything. Her gaze remained fixed on the floor, on the intricate patterns of the Persian rug, as if the answers were woven into its threads. "It's a job," she said, her voice barely audible, a fragile defense against the weight of his presence. He could see the pulse beating frantically at the base of her throat. She was afraid of him. The thought was a shard of ice in his gut. She had never been afraid of him, not even when she'd first learned the true nature of his business. She had seen past the monster, to the man. Now, she only saw the monster. He took another slow step forward, closing the space between them until he could smell the faint, clean scent of laundry soap clinging to her uniform, a scent so jarringly domestic in this world of steel and blood. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice soft but unyielding. The tone he used when disobedience was not an option. Slowly, reluctantly, she lifted her head. Her eyes, the same warm, deep brown eyes that had once held galaxies of love for him, were now clouded with fear, exhaustion, and a fierce, stubborn pride. He let his gaze drift pointedly down to the curve of her stomach, then back to her face. The question was there, raw and unspoken, hanging in the air. "Is it mine?" Her chin trembled, but she held his gaze. A silent, defiant confirmation. A universe of implications unfolded in that single, shared look. His son, or his daughter, growing inside the woman who had vanished from his life without a word, now scrubbing floors in his hotel. The sheer, savage irony of it was a physical blow. A bitter, metallic taste filled his mouth. He felt a rage so pure and cold it was almost calming. It was not directed at her, but at the world, at the circumstances, at his own failures that had led them to this moment. Min-jun re-entered the room, his footsteps silent. He stopped at a respectful distance, his face impassive, awaiting orders. He had seen Samira. He knew exactly who she was. His lack of reaction was a testament to his discipline. "Min-jun," Jin-woo said, his eyes never leaving Samira's face. "Find out who hired her. Find out who gave her this assignment. And find a reason to have them removed." Quietly, he then turned his attention back to her. "You will come with me." It wasn't a request. She opened her mouth to protest, a spark of her old fire flashing in her eyes. "I can't. I'll lose my job." "You've already lost your job," he stated, the words flat and final. He turned and walked towards his private elevator, expecting her to follow. He didn't look back to see if she was complying. He knew she would. In this world, his world, she no longer had a choice. He was taking back control. He would wrap her in walls of steel and silence if he had to, but he would not lose her again. He would not lose his child. The guilt was a living thing, clawing at him. He remembered the last time he saw her, the argument, the desperation in her voice when she'd begged him to leave the life. He'd told her he couldn't. He'd told her he had it all under control. The memory was a mockery now. The elevator ride to his private residential wing was silent and suffocating. Samira stood in the corner, as far from him as the mirrored walls would allow, her arms wrapped protectively around her stomach. Jin-woo watched her reflection, the harsh overhead lighting carving new lines of hardship onto a face he had once memorized by moonlight. He saw not the ghost of the woman he loved, but a survivor, someone who had been weathered and worn down but not broken. The sight fueled a fresh wave of self-loathing. While he had been building an empire of glass and shadows, she had been fighting a war alone. The elevator opened directly into his penthouse apartment, a space of minimalist, brutalist design. Cold marble floors, vast panes of glass, furniture that was more art than comfort. It was a fortress, not a home. It had felt empty for 5 years. Now, with her standing hesitantly on the threshold, it felt like a tomb. "Sit," he said, gesturing towards a severe leather sofa. She remained standing, her posture rigid. Her defiance was quiet but absolute. He didn't press the issue. He walked to the bar, his back to her, and poured 2 glasses of water, his hands steady despite the tremor deep inside him. He placed one on the black granite coffee table in front of the sofa. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice even. "There's nothing to tell," she replied, her voice still tight. "I needed work." This was available. The oversimplification was an insult to his intelligence. He turned to face her, leaning back against the bar, crossing his arms. He would wait. He had learned patience in rooms far more hostile than this one. He could outwait her pride. His mind was already racing, connecting dots, forming strategies. He needed information. Minjun was his best instrument, a scalpel for excising truths from the world. He had already sent a coded message to him before they'd even stepped into the elevator. Her life. From the day she left until now. Every detail. No stone unturned. He needed to know who she had been with, where she had lived, who had hurt her. The thought of another man touching her, of her struggling while he lived in sterile luxury, sent a possessive, primal fury through him. He had to contain it, to channel it. Emotion was a liability. It was the lesson his father had beaten into him. It was the lesson that had allowed him to survive and thrive. But with Samira, the rules had always been different. She was the one variable he could never control, the one exception to his every ironclad rule. Now she was back, bringing chaos and a child he hadn't known existed, and his perfectly ordered world was tilting on its axis. He watched her, really watched her, and saw the subtle signs of long-term stress, the faint darkness under her eyes, the way she held her shoulders as if carrying an immense weight, the worn-out soles of her cheap shoes. He had surrounded himself with wealth and power, yet he had let his most precious possession fall into ruin. Minjun's report arrived 3 hours later on a secured tablet. Jinwoo sat in his sterile office, the city lights a cold, distant fire outside his window. He hadn't pressed Samira further. He had simply had a guest room prepared, a room she had entered without a word and locked from the inside. The click of the lock had been louder than a gunshot. Now, he read, and with each line, the cold rage inside him solidified into something harder, heavier, and infinitely more dangerous. The report was concise, brutal in its efficiency. Samira hadn't left him for someone else. She had left for him. Minjun's sources had unearthed a 5-year-old piece of intel, a threat from the very syndicate he had just dismissed, the old guard of the Busan faction, before the current leadership had taken over. They had sent her a picture. It was of him, taken through a sniper's scope, a red, painted on his temple. The message was simple: disappear or he will. She had done it to save his life. She had cut herself off from everyone, changed her name, moved to a small town, and worked a series of low-paying jobs to survive. She had never asked for a thing. There was no other man. There had never been another man. The report detailed her struggles: a lost job at a diner when her pregnancy became apparent, an eviction from a small, damp apartment, the mounting medical bills she had no way of paying. She had come back to Seoul out of sheer desperation, taking the first job she could find, which, in a stroke of cruel fate, was at the flagship hotel of the man she had given up everything to protect. The baby. A paternity test wasn't necessary. Minjun had included the timeline of her departure. The child was his son. He had a son. The tablet screen blurred. Jinwoo closed his eyes, the image of her, tired and defiant in that ugly uniform, burning behind his eyelids. The guilt was a physical entity, a black hole in his chest, consuming everything. He had spent 5 years believing she had abandoned him, that their love had meant nothing. He had let that belief curdle into a cynical, bitter hardness that had served him well in his world. He had become colder, more ruthless, more untouchable. And all that time, she had been carrying the entire burden of his safety, of their child, alone. He had mourned the loss of her love, while she had been actively sacrificing everything for his life. The depth of her love, her loyalty, was staggering. It was a debt he could never repay. He stood up and walked to the window, placing his palm against the cool glass. Below, the city was a web of light and movement, a kingdom he commanded. And he had been a fool. A king ruling over an empty castle. He had all this power, and he hadn't been able to protect the one person who mattered. He had failed in the most fundamental way a man could fail. That failure would now be rectified. The old Busan guard who had threatened her. He knew their names. He had let them retire, believing their teeth had been pulled. He now realized they had left a poison in his system that had been slowly killing him for 5 years. The time for quiet retirement was over. He turned from the window, his course set. First, he would secure Samira. He would tear down her pride with infuriating kindness. He would build her a sanctuary and dare her to leave it. Then he would go to war. Not a loud, messy war, but a quiet, precise, and utter annihilation. He would erase the men who had taken his life from him, and he would do it so completely that history would forget they had ever existed. The next morning, Samira found her world had been subtly and irrevocably altered. When she emerged from the guest room, her maid uniform was gone. In its place, laid out on the bed, were soft cotton trousers, a loose-fitting silk blouse, and comfortable slippers. There was a note on the nightstand, not in Jin-woo's handwriting, but in Min-jun's precise, impersonal script. It informed her that her employment with the hotel had been terminated with a generous severance package, and that all her personal belongings from her previous residence had been retrieved and were in the closet. A gilded cage, just as she'd feared. She walked into the main living area, her heart a cold knot of apprehension. Jin-woo was not there. Instead, a small table had been set for one by the window, laden with a breakfast that was clearly designed by a nutritionist: fresh fruit, yogurt, whole-grain toast. There was a small bottle of prenatal vitamins placed next to the plate. The calculated, impersonal care was more unnerving than an overt display of power. He was managing her, handling her like a delicate and valuable asset. Later that day, a doctor arrived, a quiet, professional woman who introduced herself as Dr. Kim. She explained that Mr. Kwon had arranged for her to take over Samira's prenatal care. The examination was thorough, conducted right there in the penthouse. Samira submitted, feeling a sense of surreal detachment. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand, her own body now a subject of clinical interest. Jin-woo finally appeared in the evening. He entered the living room where she was sitting, staring out at the city lights, feeling as distant from them as if she were on the moon. He didn't speak at first, simply taking a seat in the armchair opposite her. He looked different. The cold fury from yesterday had been replaced by a heavy, somber calm. "The doctor said you and the baby are healthy," he began, his voice a low murmur. "But you're underweight. You need to rest." "What is this, Jin-woo?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Am I your prisoner?" He met her gaze, his own dark eyes holding a universe of emotions she couldn't begin to decipher. "You're my guest," he said. "And you are the mother of my child. You will be protected. That is not negotiable. I don't need your protection," she shot back, the words tasting like ash. "I've been fine on my own." "No," he said, the words sharp and final. "You haven't. And I know why." The statement hung in the air, heavy and damning. He knew. He knew she had left to save him. The thought sent a jolt of panic through her. If he knew, he would retaliate. He would start the war she had sacrificed everything to prevent. "Don't," she pleaded, the single word conveying all of her fear. "Whoever told you, whatever you think you know, just leave it alone. Please." He stood up and walked to the window, his back to her. "The men who drove you away from me," he said, his reflection a dark silhouette against the glittering skyline, "who made you suffer alone for 5 years, they made a mistake. They underestimated how thoroughly I protect what is mine. They assumed my memory was short. It is not. He turned back to face her, and the look in his eyes made her blood run cold. It was a look she had seen only once before, when a rival had betrayed him. That rival had disappeared from the face of the earth. This is no longer your burden to carry, Samira. It is mine. Your only concern is your health, and the health of our son, he had said it. Our son. The words bound them together with a chain of unbreakable steel. You will stay here, he continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. You will have everything you need. When the time comes, I will be there. After he is born, you are free to make a choice. But until then, you are under my protection. This is the only way. He was not asking for her permission. He was informing her of the new reality. Life in the penthouse settled into a strange, silent routine. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun over the city. Samira was a ghost in a palace, drifting through the cavernous, silent rooms. Her every need was anticipated and met with a quiet efficiency that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. Books she had once mentioned enjoying appeared on the coffee table. The chef prepared meals based on her favorite foods, information undoubtedly gleaned from Minjun's exhaustive report. Soft, non-restrictive clothing filled the closet. It was a prison of perfect consideration. Jinwoo was a constant, hovering presence. He was often physically absent, gone for long hours managing his vast, shadowy enterprises, but she felt him everywhere, in the watchful eyes of the discreet security detail posted on the floor, in the respectful deference of the small staff allowed to service the penthouse, in the very air she breathed. He returned every evening, without fail. They would share the dinner meal in near silence. He would ask about her day, about the baby, his questions brief and formal. She would give short, clipped answers. The space between them was charged with 5 years of unspoken words, of pain, of love and loss. She would watch him when he thought she wasn't looking. She saw the exhaustion in the set of his shoulders, a weariness that hadn't been there 5 years ago. His empire was a heavy crown. She saw the way his eyes would linger on her stomach, a look of profound wonder and a deep, aching regret. He never touched her. The lack of physical contact was a palpable thing, a chasm between them. One evening, she was reading on the sofa when a faint, fluttering movement started in her belly. The baby was kicking. It was the first time she had felt it so strongly. An involuntary gasp escaped her lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated wonder. Jinwoo, who had been reading reports at his desk across the room, looked up instantly, his focus absolute. "What is it?" he asked, a rare note of alarm in his voice. "Are you all right?" She shook her head, a slow smile spreading across her face, the first genuine smile she had felt in months. "He's kicking," she whispered. He stood up and walked over, his movements hesitant, uncertain. He stopped before the sofa, looking down at her, his gaze locked on her abdomen. "Can I?" he asked, his voice rough. It was the first time he had asked her for permission for anything. She nodded, her heart pounding. Slowly, as if approaching a wild, easily startled creature, he knelt before her. He reached out a hand, his long, elegant fingers trembling almost imperceptibly, and gently placed his palm on her belly. He held his breath, his entire body rigid with concentration. And then it happened, a distinct, firm kick against his palm. His eyes shot up to meet hers, and in their depths, she saw the impenetrable Mafia boss, the cold-hearted ruler, vanish completely. In his place was a man filled with a raw, breathtaking awe. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. In that moment, kneeling on the floor with his hand on her belly, his face a mask of shattered composure, the walls between them began to crumble into dust. The fragile truce forged in that moment of shared wonder began to grow. The silences between them became less heavy, punctuated by small, tentative conversations. He would tell her about a building he was constructing, stripping the story of its illicit details and focusing on the architecture, the design. She would talk about a book she was reading, about the baby, about the strange cravings she was having. They were circling each other, relearning the language they had once shared. He started leaving his work at the office, spending his evenings in the penthouse, content to just be in the same room with her. He was re-establishing his presence in her life, not as a warlord, but as a partner, a father. But the world outside the penthouse continued to turn, and the shadows Jin-woo commanded were long and deep. One afternoon, Min-jun arrived, his face grimmer than usual. He and Jin-woo spoke in low, rapid Korean in the office, but Samira could feel the tension radiating through the closed door. When Jin-woo emerged, the cold, dangerous calm was back in place. "There's a problem," he said, his voice flat. He didn't elaborate, but she knew. It was the men from Busan. Her past had come back to haunt them both. "I have to go away for a few days," he continued. "Min-jun will be here. The security on this floor will be tripled. You will not leave this apartment for any reason. Do you understand?" The order was absolute. The fear she had lived with for 5 years returned, cold and sharp. "Don't do anything reckless, Jin-woo," she pleaded. "Please." "It's not worth it." He walked over to her and, for the first time since her return, he reached out and touched her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. His touch was electric, a jolt of memory and longing. "There is nothing more worthy of it," he said, his eyes intense. "They tried to take you from me. They tried to take my son. There is no corner of the earth they can hide where I will not find them." He was going to war for her. For them. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. It was the very thing she had run from, the violence she had tried to escape. But now it felt different. It was not the violence of a gangster protecting his territory. It was the fury of a man protecting his family. He left that night. The penthouse, which had started to feel like a sanctuary, once again became a cage. The silence was heavier than ever, filled with her anxiety. She spent the next 2 days pacing, unable to read, unable to eat, her hand resting constantly on her belly, as if to shield her son from a danger he could not yet comprehend. On the 3rd night, she was woken from a restless sleep by a sharp, cramping pain in her lower back. She sat up, her breath catching in her throat. It came again, stronger this time, wrapping around her abdomen like a band of steel. She knew, with a sudden, terrifying certainty, what was happening. The baby was coming. Too early. She was only at 34 weeks. Panic seized her. She reached for the intercom Jin-woo had installed by the bed, her fingers fumbling with the button. "Min-jun," she gasped, her voice tight with pain. "It's the baby. I think it's time." The response was instantaneous. Within seconds, Min-jun was at her door, his calm demeanor a steadying anchor in her sea of panic. Behind him, 2 members of the security team stood ready, their faces grim. "Dr. Kim is on her way," Min-jun said, his voice even. "An ambulance is en route to the private entrance." "We are ready." There was no chaos, only a chillingly efficient protocol being executed. He was prepared for this. Jin-woo had prepared him for this. As another contraction seized her, doubling her over, her only thought was of Jin-woo. He was out there, somewhere in the darkness, fighting a war for them, and he didn't know. He wasn't here. The thought was an agony sharper than the physical pain. Min-jun seemed to read her mind. "The chairman has been notified," he said, using Jin-woo's formal title. "He is on his way." The journey to the hospital was a blur of motion and controlled urgency. The private ambulance, escorted by 2 black sedans that cleared traffic with silent, intimidating authority, moved through the city like a spear. Dr. Kim was with her, monitoring her, speaking in a calm, reassuring voice that barely registered over the roaring in Samira's ears. All she could focus on was the rhythmic crest and fall of the contractions and the desperate, primal need for Jin-woo to be with her. They arrived at a private, state-of-the-art medical facility that looked more like a luxury hotel than a hospital. A team was waiting, and she was whisked through silent corridors to a private birthing suite. Everything was sterile, efficient, and impersonal. She felt disconnected from it all, a vessel for the life that was fighting its way into the world. Hours passed. The pain intensified, blurring time into a long, agonizing wave. Through it all, she clung to one thought: Jin-woo. Just as she felt her strength begin to fade, when the doctor's voice began to sound distant, The door to the suite burst open. Jin-woo stood there, his suit disheveled, a dark smudge of what looked like dirt on his cheek, and a small, clean cut above his eyebrow. His eyes, wild and frantic, found hers across the room. The cold, controlled mask of the Mafia boss was gone. He was just a man, terrified for his wife and child. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his hand finding hers, his grip strong and sure. "I'm here," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm here, Samira. I'm not leaving." He hadn't just been notified. He had torn his way back from whatever darkness he had been in to get to her. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, the words a raw confession. "I'm sorry for all of it in that moment. The 5 years of pain, the fear, the loneliness, it all washed away. The walls were gone. There was no Mafia boss, no poor maid. There was only a man and a woman, facing the birth of their child together. "He's coming, Jin-woo," she gasped, squeezing his hand. "Our son," he looked at her, his eyes shining with an emotion so fierce, so powerful, it took her breath away. "Then let's go meet him," he said, his voice thick with a love that had survived silence, distance, and death itself. The final hours of labor were a crucible, forging them together in a way that 5 years of separation could not break. Jin-woo never left her side. He was a constant, grounding presence, holding her hand, wiping the sweat from her brow, whispering words of encouragement that were as raw and real as her pain. He met every one of her cries with a strength that flowed into her, his composure a rock for her to cling to. He watched, stripped of all his power and authority, in complete awe of her strength, her resilience. He was a king in his own world, but in this room, she was a goddess, and he was merely a worshipper at her altar. Then, with one final, monumental effort, their son was born. A wave of sound filled the room, a lusty, indignant cry that was the most beautiful music Jin-woo had ever heard. The doctor laid the baby on Samira's chest, a tiny, perfect being, his skin still slick from birth. He was small, but he was perfect. Samira was crying, tears of exhaustion and pure, overwhelming joy streaming down her face. Jin-woo could only stare, his heart feeling like it was going to burst from his chest. This was his son, his blood, the physical manifestation of his love for this incredible woman. A nurse gently took the baby to be cleaned and weighed. Jin-woo leaned down and kissed Samira's forehead, a long, lingering kiss filled with reverence and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered against her skin. "You did it. You were so strong." Later, when things had quieted down, a nurse brought their son back, now swaddled in a soft white blanket. She placed him in Jin-woo's arms. He held the tiny bundle, his large, calloused hands that had signed death warrants and brokered ruthless deals, looking impossibly gentle as they supported the fragile weight of his child. He looked down at the small, sleeping face, the tuft of dark hair, the impossibly small fingers. And in that moment, Kwon Jin-woo, the feared and untouchable leader of the Eclipses, was irrevocably transformed. The ambition, the rage, the need for control, it all seemed like a hollow echo from another life. All that mattered was this tiny, warm life in his arms and the exhausted, beautiful woman smiling at him from the bed. He knew what he had to do. The war he had just fought in the shadows of Busan was not the end. It was the beginning of a different kind of war, a war to cleanse his world, to build a fortress of peace around his family. He sat in the chair beside Samira's bed, his son nestled against his chest, and watched her sleep. He would not fail them again. He would burn down his own empire, if it meant keeping them safe. He would become a different man. For them. The promise was a silent, sacred vow made in the sterile quiet of the hospital room, witnessed only by the steady beep of the heart monitor and the soft breathing of his newborn son. The weeks that followed were a blur of healing and discovery. They did not return to the cold, glass penthouse. Instead, Jin-woo took them to a house he had owned for years but had never lived in. It was nestled in a quiet, green enclave on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by high stone walls and ancient pine trees. It was secure, a fortress in its own right, but it felt like a home. It had a garden, rooms filled with warm light, and an air of peaceful permanence. Here, away from the watchful eyes of his organization, they began to build a new life, one tentative step at a time. The power dynamics that had once defined their reunion slowly dissolved, replaced by the mundane, sacred rituals of parenthood. They named their son Daehyun, a name that meant great and honorable. Jinwoo proved to be a natural father. He learned to change diapers, to soothe the baby's cries with a low, rumbling hum, to walk the floors with him in the dead of night. Samira would watch him, this man who commanded legions of dangerous men, completely captivated by the tiny movements of their son's hands. She saw the man she had first fallen in love with, the man who existed beneath the layers of ice and steel. In the quiet moments, they talked. They finally spoke of the day she left, of the fear and the impossible choice she had made. He told her of the 5 years of emptiness, of the cold shell he had become, believing she had abandoned him. There were no accusations, only the quiet sharing of pain, a lancing of old wounds that could finally begin to heal. "I was wrong," he said one evening, as they sat in the nursery, the soft light of a lamp casting long shadows. Daehyun was sleeping in his arms. "I built an empire to protect myself, but I couldn't protect you. I pushed you away with the very life I thought was making me strong. I'm sorry, Samire. For all of it, I was wrong too," she admitted, her voice soft. "I should have trusted you. I should have come to you. I was so afraid of what you would do, of the war you would start, that I didn't think about the war it would start inside you." He reached out his free hand, and she took it, their fingers lacing together. It was a simple gesture, but it sealed the final crack in the foundation of their new life. It was forgiveness. It was acceptance. It was a promise. Minjun still came to the house, his visits brief and discreet, bringing reports that Jinwoo would review in his study. Samira knew he was still managing his world, but something had fundamentally shifted. The ruthlessness was still there, but it was now channeled with a singular purpose: to create a shield around their family. He was dismantling the most dangerous parts of his operation, transitioning his wealth into legitimate enterprises, cutting ties with the violent factions that had once been his allies. He was building a legacy for his son, not an empire of fear. One perfect autumn afternoon, they were in the garden. Jinwoo was pushing Daehyun in a swing, a genuine, unguarded smile on his face. Samira watched from a bench, a feeling of peace settling over her, so profound it was almost overwhelming. Jinwoo stopped the swing and walked over to her, sitting down beside her. He took her hand. "Stay with me," he said, his voice quiet but firm, his dark eyes searching hers. "Not as my guest. Not as my prisoner. Be my wife again. Let's be a family. Here." In the light, it wasn't a command. It wasn't the negotiation. It was a plea from the deepest part of his soul. She looked from his face to her son, who was gurgling happily in the swing, and she knew she was home. She had never truly left it. She leaned in and kissed him, a soft, gentle kiss that held all the promise of their future. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. Always the war was over. The silence was broken. And in the quiet garden, under the warm sun, their family was finally, truly whole.